Hi, and welcome to one of our manifesto special videos. I'm Roger Holman, and I'm going to be joined by Tom, who's going to be talking about pensions. Tom, you're our pensions guy and have been taking a special interest in what's in and not in the manifestos as relates to pensions.
Yeah, sure. So thanks, Roger. So I think the main thing from a state pensions perspective is that all three of the main parties, so Conservatives, Lib Dems and Labour, have all committed to maintain the triple lock, so essentially guaranteeing some minimum movement upwards of the state pension every year. Now, the Conservatives have gone one step further and said that for pensioners, they will put in place the triple lock plus, which essentially means that the personal allowance, which is currently sort of hovering around the same level, that will automatically move up with the state pension, but just for pensioners. Now, this sounds on the face of it like a really good news story. But I think, to be honest, it's a little bit of a distraction away from, for example, some of the fiscal drag, as we call it, the effects of freezing the tax bands over the last few years. So whilst the Conservatives, for example, make promises not to hike up taxes, the fact that they've frozen bands means that essentially people are paying more tax. Now, the effect of ratcheting up that personal allowance for pensioners will minimise the effects of that, obviously, for that population. But it creates a two-tier system. It creates more complexity within the system, more friction and less understanding. And to be honest, I don't think it's going to move the needle very much. So I think one of the things we really need to look at is not just the state pension going up in line with, say, inflation in wages or in CPI or a minimum of 2.5%, but it's actually looking at whether the amounts that pensioners are receiving are in and of itself adequate for funding retirement. So I think really we need to move beyond the three main parties' promises around the state pensions and look a little bit at what they're doing or what they haven't said they're going to do around occupational pensions.
So you were talking about the state pension not being adequate. How does it compare internationally?
So actually, if you sort of look at, for example, any of the research by the OECD, they compile tables of sort of replacement rates per country. And the UK is woefully behind, let's say, the EU 27 and the, I think it's 38 countries in the OECD. And I think, you know, even if you factor in things like auto-enrolment, so the nest pensions, which came into place around 10 years ago, actually that gap between the UK and the average of those EU 27 and OECD 38, there's still some gap there. So there's clearly still something for employers and the government to be doing to boost those earnings for people approaching retirement. Now, what the Conservatives have said they're going to do is they published a set of proposed reforms in the last year, so-called the so-called Mansion House reforms. And there's a lot of detail in there, but essentially there's some really good stuff essentially around how it's going to create more value for pension members and what that sort of pathway looks like. My concern, though, is that there was some pretty ambitious stuff in there. So, for example, there's this idea that as an employee moves between employers, they can carry one pot with them and they can ask their new employer to pay into that pot instead. Now, this sounds like a really good idea in theory, and there are some countries that do this. So Australia is one where you have choice over what superannuation fund you pay into. I think the problem with going on to achieve something like that is actually it's going to create a lot of admin for employers, and what you may find is that it disrupts the pricing mechanisms within pension plans, and essentially if that means that pensions become more expensive to deliver the same value, somebody's going to have to pick up that cost, and it's either going to be the employer or the employee. Now, Labour, on the other hand, they haven't set out exactly what their plans are around pension reform, but what they are doing is saying, you know, we do need to look at this and we need to focus on member outcomes. So whether or not that's perhaps signalling something that feels a little bit like the Mansion House reforms, but just doesn't commit to them, it'll be interesting to see if they get into power what they do. So I think, you know, in the case of either the Conservatives or Labour forming the next government, there'll be some interesting and hopefully some positive moves to increase member value through both the state pension and also through occupational pensions. But I'm just a little bit concerned to see how exactly that's going to play out and how achievable it's going to be. So I think that's one to watch.
So you don't think they're going to be bringing back defined benefit pensions for everyone then?
Well, I think, for some of us who are in the young generation, I think that the idea of a defined benefit pension has, unfortunately, definitely that ship has sailed. But there is something in the Mansion House reforms around the potential of a collective defined contribution scheme being something that could come into play, which sits somewhere in the camp between the two. So again, interesting to see how that could come about potentially under either government. Whatever the outcome from July the 4th, what I would really like to see is the government backing more of a review into current auto enrolment and perhaps looking at how we boost that so that people kind of automatically get a higher level of benefits at retirement through both a combination of the state pension and also occupational pensions.
Thanks, Tom. If you've got any questions on anything we've discussed today and how it may affect you, please get in touch using the form on this page.